Today, a picture of American heartland, waves of golden wheat, orderly towns, a steady place in the nation's center. But rewind the 19th century, and this land was not a picture of calm. It was a prophecy. It was a battleground before the war and a scar after it. It was the place where America's most violent contradictions were dragged into the blinding sunlight and told to settle the matter. This is not merely a story of pioneers and prairie. It is the story of an idea forced into being at gunpoint. A story where the very map was a moral argument and the soil drank blood before it ever grew a bushel of grain. This is the story of Kansas in the 1800s, the crucible of the plains. Our story begins not with settlers, but with erasure. For millennia, this was not empty land. It was the domain of the Kansa, the Osage, the Pawnee, the Kiowa, and the Comanche. Their world was defined by the great buffalo herds, a migratory life of immense skill and spiritual depth. But to the American government in Washington, peering west from the Missouri line, it was the Great American Desert, a blank space on the map, an obstacle, and then a commodity. With the Indian Removal Act of 1830, the blank space was given a new, grim purpose, a dumping ground. Tribe after tribe from the east, the Delaware, the Shawnee, the Kickapoo, the Potawatomi, were forcibly relocated here, promised this permanent Indian frontier. Kansas became a cramped mosaic of displaced nations, a desperate, sorrowful patchwork. The first seeds of conflict were sown not over black slavery, but over the dispossession of its original peoples. The stage was being set, and the first players were already victims. The catalyst for chaos arrived packaged in democracy. The year is 1854. Congress passes the Kansas-Nebraska Act, spearheaded by Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas. The Grand Compromise of 1820, which forbade slavery north of a certain line, is ripped up. The new doctrine is popular sovereignty. The people of each territory will vote, will decide for themselves, slave, state, or free. The map is now a moral battleground, and Kansas, bordering the slave state of Missouri, is the first testing ground. The race is on. Almost overnight, two rival governments take root. From New England, funded by abolitionist societies like the New England Emigrant Aid Company, come the Free-Staters. They come with Sharps rifles shipped in crates marked Bibles, with a fierce conviction to keep the soil free. They found towns like Lawrence and Topeka named for heroes of liberty. From Missouri and the pro-slavery South come the Border Ruffians. They see Kansas as rightful slave soil, a buffer for their own institution. They pour over the border not to settle but to vote, illegally, repeatedly, violently. They establish a pro-slavery capital at Lecompton. The ballot box is not a vessel of democracy, it is a weapon, and when it fails, others are readily at hand. What follows is not a war yet, it is a bloody, lawless preview. Bleeding Kansas. The name itself becomes a newspaper headline, a scream in the national conscience. In 1856, a pro-slavery posse sacks the Free State town of Lawrence, burning the hotel and newspaper offices. In retribution, a fanatical abolitionist from Ohio, a man of Old Testament wrath named John Brown, marches to Potawatomi Creek with 4 of his sons and 2 other men. They drag 5 pro-slavery settlers from their cabins and hack them to death with broadswords. It is not a battle. It is a slaughter, a horror that shocks even his allies. Kansas becomes a land of midnight raids, of burned cabins, of neighbors turned executioners. The prairie grass hides ambushes. The lines are blurred between guerrilla, settler, and ideologue. The nation watches, paralyzed. The Senate floor becomes a physical battleground when a South Carolina congressman nearly beats a Massachusetts senator to death with a cane over the insults hurled about Kansas. The territory is a gaping wound on the body of the Union, and the infection is spreading. Amidst this terror, life, stubborn, ordinary life, tries to take root. Families huddle in sod houses, nests of snakes and dirt, battling blizzards, prairie fires, and biblical swarms of grasshoppers that darken the sun and devour every green shred. Women, isolated for months, go mad from the endless wind and emptiness. This is the frontier not of romance, but of grit and sheer will. And for the enslaved people of Missouri, this violent, chaotic territory becomes a beacon. The first steps of the Underground Railroad lead here to Kansas. It is a perilous refuge, but it is a start. The conflict over whether slaves can be here is answered, piece by piece, by the desperate, breathing reality of those who arrive seeking freedom. The Civil War, when it erupts in 1861, does not come to Kansas as a new event. It is a continuation. Only now the uniforms are official. Kansas enters the Union as a free state in January of 1861, but its war had begun years earlier. It sends a higher proportion of its men to fight for the Union than any other state, and the violence spills over with a peculiar ferocity. In 1863, Confederate guerrilla William Quantrill leads over 400 men in a dawn raid on Lawrence, now a symbol of free state abolitionism. They murder nearly 200 men and boys, burning much of the town to the ground. It is the worst atrocity against civilians in the entire war. The reprisals are swift and brutal, scorching western Missouri. This is not a war of distant battlefields. It is a war of neighbors, of vendetta etched into the memory of every scorched farmstead. Peace in 1865 does not bring calm. It brings a different kind of storm. The great project of the post-war nation is the railroad. And Kansas is the path. The Union Pacific and the Kansas Pacific race westward, bringing with them the hell-on-wheels towns, mobile cities of vice, gambling, and violence like Abilene and Hays City. Buffalo hunters like William F. Buffalo Bill, Cody, wage industrial slaughter, killing thousands of the great beasts to feed the railroad workers, and more systematically to starve the plains tribes into submission. The bones of the herds whiten the earth, a second erasure. With the buffalo gone, the tribes are defeated, confined to reservations. The permanent Indian frontier vanishes, broken by treaty, hunger, and the repeating rifle. Now the land is truly officially empty, and America has a new use for it. The Homestead Act of 1862 promised 160 acres to any who would live on and improve it. A siren song goes out across the oceans and across the weary East, free land. The Great Migration begins. Thousands pour in Civil War veterans, freedmen known as exodusters fleeing the terror of the post-war South, immigrants from Germany, Sweden, Russia, Bohemia. They break the ancient sod with steel plows, they plant wheat and corn. They build churches and schools out of the very earth that once seemed so hostile. Towns spring up like prairie flowers after a rain, but the land is a fickle partner. The 1870s bring a boom fueled by railroad hype and wet years. Speculation runs wild. Then the inevitable bust. The panic of 1873, banks fail, dreams evaporate, and then nature itself rebels. The 1870s also bring the first of the great grasshopper plagues, clouds so thick they blot out the sun, leaving behind absolute desolation. This is the first hint that the agricultural paradise is a fragile gamble. The gamble seems to pay off in the 1880s, another boom. This is the era of the sodhouse frontier, but also of growing towns with opera houses and electric lights. Kansas becomes the wheat state, but the roots are shallow. The farmers are at the mercy of the railroads who charge exorbitant rates and the banks who hold their debts. A sense of bitter betrayal grows. This is not the independence they were promised. This is a new kind of serfdom. The discontent finds a voice, radical and impassioned. The People's Party, the Populists, is born in the soil of Kansas. It is a firestorm of farmer anger. Mary Elizabeth Lease, a fiery orator, reportedly tells farmers to raise less corn and more hell. They demand public ownership of railroads, a graduated income tax, free silver to inflate currency and ease debt. In 1890, they sweep the state. For a moment, Kansas is the radical heart of America, threatening to upend the entire economic order. The East looks on in alarm at this wild-eyed rebellion brewing in the nation's breadbasket. And then the land delivers its final, brutal judgment on the century's ambitions. The wet years end. The rains fail. The great wheat frontier had pushed west into lands too arid for sustainable farming. The winds, always present, now have nothing to hold the soil. The 1890s bring the first of the great droughts. Crops wither. Wells run dry. The sky turns a bronzed, relentless blue. And then the winds lift the very earth itself. It is the first warning, a taste of the Dust Bowl to come 40 years later. The topsoil, the precious skin of the plains that took millennia to form, simply blows away in black blizzards that darken the sky as far as Chicago. Farms are buried, dreams are choked out. The great agricultural boom collapses into a parched, howling bust. The populist political revolution, too, begins to falter, absorbed by the Democrats and fading under the weight of economic reality and nature's vengeance. As the century closes, Kansas is exhausted. It is a veteran of holy wars and natural disasters. It has been a promised land, a battleground, a gold rush, and a dust bowl. The wild optimism of the homesteader has been tempered by a hard, pragmatic realism. The state that was born in a storm of violence and ideology has been chastened by the relentless wind and sun. So what is Kansas as the 1800s end? It is not a paradise, nor merely a victim. It is America in microcosm, stripped bare. A place where the highest ideals of freedom and the basest instincts of greed and violence collided with raw, unforgiving nature. The layers of its modern identity were forged here. The steadfast agricultural power, the political bellwether, the conservative heartland, all born from the trauma of bleeding Kansas and the haunting emptiness of the prairie. The 1800s closed not with an answer, but with a deep, ingrained knowledge. a knowledge of struggle, of the cost of conviction, and of the profound, silent power of the land itself, which would always, in the end, have the final say. The crucible had cooled, leaving a shape that was strong, resilient, and forever marked by the fire that formed it.